HIV is rising in the Middle East and North Africa. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Globally, if you look at the new infections since about 2010, they've declined by almost 40%. Except in our region, in the Middle East and North Africa, they've increased by a whopping 61%.
Today we have with us Shereen El Feki. She was the Vice Chairwoman of the United Nations Global Commission on HIV and the Law, an author most notable for her work, Sex and the Citadel.
What we don't have in the Arab region is really a very clear sense empirically about people's sexual practices, because governments won't let us ask those questions. You cannot do a national survey. What's happening in our intimate lives reflects what's happening on a broader stage. If you really want to know a people, you start by looking inside their bedrooms.
Welcome to another episode of Yalla Let's Talk. Today we have with us no other than Shereen El Feki. Shereen El Feki is a British journalist and author most notable for her work Sex and the Citadel, Intimate Life in a Changing Arab World. After the 2001 WTC terror attacks, she learned Arabic and started to research the Middle East, in particular the issues of emancipation and women's sexuality, spending much of her time in Egypt. From 2010 to 2012, she was the Vice Chairwoman of the United Nations Global Commission on HIV and the Law. El Feki published Sex and the Citadel, Intimate Life in a Changing Arab World, which has been translated into Dutch, Bahasa Indonesia, French, and German, with Spanish and Arabic translations forthcoming. Welcome, Shereen El Feki.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, so Shereen, I want to just start off by asking you what grew your curiosity in studying sex as a field, as a topic.
So it's interesting. It comes from my personal and professional background. So you've described me as a British journalist, but I'm actually half Egyptian, half British. Now it's interesting because it's my father who's Egyptian and my mother who's British. But when I'm in the Arab world, everyone says to me, but wait a minute, they're very confused. They said, Abuki Masri, tab inti Masri khalas. So it's very interesting that people in the Arab world see me as fully Egyptian. But I do have this half-half connection to both the West and the East. So my interest in using sex as a lens through which to understand the Arab world came from my personal background. I grew up as an Egyptian Muslim, born in Britain, raised in Canada. So raised almost like a born again Muslim, really. I had this, or born again Arab. I had this heritage, but I didn't really explore it very much. I had the connection. We visited the family in Egypt, all that. But it was really, as you say, after September 11th that I became more interested in connecting to my Arab heritage. What's interesting is that I chose sex as my lens because my professional background, I'm trained as an immunologist. My first job was as the healthcare correspondent of the Economist magazine, and part of my remit was covering the global HIV epidemic. Because of my connection to the Arab world, I became interested in HIV in the Arab world. And when you start looking at that, you then enter into the realm of sexuality. And very quickly, it became clear to me that sex is a really powerful lens through which to look at what is happening in a bigger space. What's happening in our intimate lives reflects what's happening on a broader stage in politics and economics and religion and culture. And so I came to the conclusion that if you really want to know a people, you start by looking inside their bedrooms. And that's what I did for 5 years when I was researching and writing Sex and the Citadel.
Well, thank you very much for clarifying that and telling us a little bit about your background. And I want to just now dive deeper into that book, Sex and the Citadel. Can you tell us a little bit more about the inspiration behind that book, as well as the title?
So the title, Sex and the Citadel. Now, I need to say that sometimes people describe it as Sex in the Citadel, which is a very different type of research. So Sex and the Citadel is clearly a play on sex and the city, but also the Citadel, Qala, is a fortress. And it's a metaphor, really, for the state of sexuality in the Arab world, because the only really socially accepted context for sexual activity is marriage. And it's not just any old marriage. It has to be approved by your family. It has to be religiously approved as well. It's following all sorts of laws and policies and that sort of thing. And that's it, really. That's the only socially acknowledged context for sexual activity. The problem we have increasingly across the Arab region is that there are growing numbers of people who are outside the citadel. So, for example, young people the age of marriage in many of our countries in the region has been increasing. If you look at some countries in North Africa, for example, the average age of marriage for men is in their early 30s, and for women, it's creeping up into their late 20s. So the issue here is, what do you do? I mean, we are enjoined as Muslims, and also Christians, to remain chaste before marriage. The problem is that that's increasingly difficult when you have to wait until your late 20s. So what are you going to do? Of course, there are populations, for example, LGBTQ plus individuals, for whom this citadel of marriage is really not an option. So the question then becomes, how do we reconcile this tension between what's inside the citadel and what's outside the citadel? And my book attempts to address that.
Incredible. And it sounds like there's a lot of depth in terms of the research when it comes to sex in the Arab world and the nuances of how we perceive sex and intimacy versus how it is perceived in this part of the world, which is us being located in Canada. I want to just dive deeper into one of the themes you've explored in your talks and in your books, is that there is this double standards that boys will be boys and women are supposed to be, the Virgin Marys, and even after they're married. So I want to ask, how does that harm our women and men today? How that mentality harms our men and women today?
Double standards in terms of expectations of men and women are not unique to the Arab region, of course. And I need to point out that a lot of the issues that I talk about in the book are found elsewhere in the world. Most societies are more or less on a spectrum of sexual hangups. The issue in the Arab region, of course, within Islam, it's an equal opportunity. I mean, both men and women are enjoined to remain chaste before marriage. But of course, we're looking at patriarchal societies. And again, there is an acceptance of what men can do and women can't. Now, how this manifests itself, for example, the primacy of female virginity is, for example, in my work on HIV. So one of the stories I tell in the book is that I have been doing outreach work with NGOs who are trying to stop the spread of HIV in the region. And so they do the usual work. They're handing out condoms to those who are at risk, including sex workers. So I was once in Casablanca, and I was out with this fantastic NGO, and they were meeting with sex workers in bars and trying to give them information about safe sex. And we met two young women, and they were hairdressing students in their early 20s, and they were turning tricks for pocket money, basically. And when the outreach workers spoke to them about using condoms to protect against HIV, they said, no. We don't need condoms. There's no chance of us getting pregnant. We only practice anal sex because we want to remain virgins before marriage. So this is really interesting. This is really interesting because their definition of virginity was an intact hymen. And in the name of the intact hymen, they were exposing themselves to all sorts of risks. And that issue is actually quite interesting because it speaks to a lot of the problems that we have around sexuality in the Arab region. There is a real gap between appearance and reality. So the appearance, an intact hymen, and the reality, are these girls really chaste? Well, they've been practicing anal sex and outer course. And the issue we have is that there's this really big gap between what we do and what we say that we are doing. And within that gap come a whole host of problems, including HIV, including sexual despair, disease, dysfunction, disorder. And part of what my book argues is that we need to find a way to bring the appearance and the reality closer together. And how can we do that in ways that follow our tradition, follow our religion, and follow our culture?
Wow. Oof, that left me speechless because there are a couple of points you mentioned that I think a lot of people tend to overlook, which is it's the appearance versus the reality. Is that we do live in this culture where there is this ideal, like we want to have this and this and that, but the reality of it is that there are people who may be having sex, but for them it's not having, vaginal, or I don't know what's the right word. Apologies. It's like, it's not, they'll be having anal sex. You mentioned in one of your talks that HIV is rising in the Middle East and North Africa. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So I've just finished a term working as the regional director for the Middle East and North Africa at UNAIDS. This is the UN agency that's spearheading the fight against HIV around the world. So it was a very, very interesting experience. And I was on the sharp end of our rising epidemic. Over the past decade or so, there have been really remarkable improvements in HIV around the world in terms of being able to tackle the disease. So just to give you a sense, globally, if you look at the new infections since about 2010, they've declined by almost 40%. Except in our region, in the Middle East and North Africa, they've increased by a whopping 61%.
Wow.
So most of the world, including what we consider to be the heartlands of HIV in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, they're doing much, much better at preventing infections and getting people on treatment. Globally, for example, about 75% or more of people who have HIV are on treatment. Except in our region, where only 50% of people are on treatment. So on almost every single measure we look at being able to test for HIV, treat people for HIV, keep them on treatment so they can live fulfilled lives, we are falling farther and farther behind the rest of the world. The reason for that has a lot to do with the stigma and discrimination associated not just with HIV, but also with the behaviors and the practices that put you at risk of HIV. So top of the list, sexual intercourse and drug use and other associated behaviors. So the problem we have, again, it's about the silence, right? It's the taboo that we need to break, because if we don't, we are going to find ourselves in the midst of a full-blown HIV epidemic. At the moment, HIV is sort of concentrated in what we call at-risk populations: men who have sex with men, people who use drugs, female sex workers, prisoners, for instance. But as we've seen in other parts of the world, epidemics that start in these sort of pockets, in these concentrated populations, quickly spread out. No man is an island. And we have an opportunity in the Middle East to block that. We could be one of the few regions in the world where the HIV epidemic does not spread. But that requires a lot of change in terms of laws and policies and just people feeling comfortable talking about these issues.
And I'm glad you mentioned that there is a lot of stigma. I think HIV, there's stigma everywhere in the world. I can imagine in the Middle East and North Africa, there is stigma. There's also precautions and implications if someone does say that they are HIV positive. Can you tell us a little bit more about what is life like for someone who is HIV positive in the Middle East and North Africa?
It's hard. It's hard. And I'll give you an example of a young man in Egypt who contacted me personally. He had discovered that he has HIV. He thought it was a death sentence. And he was firmly convinced that he was going to perish. And he was contemplating suicide. And part of the problem is we don't really have sexuality education in our schools. We don't talk a lot about HIV. So all the advances that have occurred in terms of the treatment of HIV, in much of the world, you take the medication, you lead a normal life. That sort of passed the Arab world by, right? So he had a sort of knowledge of HIV, which was basically back at about, I'd say, Philadelphia, right? The early 90s. And it's a pity because he was very fearful. He didn't know where to turn for the medication. Of course, he couldn't tell his family, because then the inevitable question arises, well, how did you get infected? And that opens a Pandora's box of further taboo. Now, he was at least lucky. In Egypt, he was able to get treatment and has gone on to lead a very successful professional life. I have been contacted by other people living with HIV. To give you a classic story, a migrant, Arab migrant who was living in one of the Gulf states, who discovered as a part of routine testing in some countries in our region, they test for HIV, particularly for migrants, discovered he had HIV and was about to be deported within 48 hours because this country in question does not allow foreigners living with HIV to stay in the country. And so he was shocked at his HIV status. He was about to get married, and this was hugely problematic because although his fiancée was absolutely fine with continuing the relationship, her family, and particularly her male relatives, said absolutely not. You cannot be with this person anymore. He was about to lose his job, and then he was about to be deported. So it's a perfect storm of someone who had a productive fulfilling personal and professional life, and it all fell apart because of a diagnosis. So this needs to change because the science tells us that there's no reason why these individuals can't go on treatment and can't live fulfilled lives. And frankly, we have new medications and new technologies that can help prevent the infection in the first place. But because we don't talk about HIV and we don't want to face up to it, these technologies aren't available in most parts of the Arab world either. So we have this amazing opportunity, but we're not seizing it.
And beautifully said, there is an opportunity to really crush down the spread of HIV and also provide treatment for people who do have HIV and break down the stigma. As we discussed, there's stigma everywhere when it comes to HIV, and people are working towards breaking that stigma. One thing you mentioned, and it's the example of someone living in Egypt and how they were able to seek treatment, and then someone else in a Gulf state that they were going to be deported. What advice would you give to someone if they're living in the region, so the Middle East and North Africa, if they were to think that they may have HIV or they've had unprotected sex, or they're experiencing symptoms, but they're afraid to be tested because what would be the outcome?
That's a tricky one, and it does depend on where you are in the region. So, for example, if you're living in Morocco, Morocco has a very, very advanced HIV response. So the government, and in particular the king, has acknowledged that for decades now that HIV is an issue. We need to address it up front. So as a consequence, they have civil society, wonderful NGOs that individuals can go to. They can get testing, they can get counseling. That's not available in many Gulf states, for instance, because you do run the risk of being deported. Now, you need to get tested, definitely, because it's not just a question of your own health. And one of the issues that we find in the Arab region is because people are really afraid to get a diagnosis. They delay being tested. And by the time they do get tested, their disease is quite advanced, and their chances of being able to do well with HIV are diminished. I would say for someone who's living in a Gulf state, frankly, if you're facing, because you are going to face deportation, is to try to get yourself tested, but also get in touch with certainly some of the local. Some of the NGOs from your home country, for instance, in the Gulf states, they don't have civil society, so they don't have HIV support groups. But to get in touch with the NGOs in your home country, because very often there are networks now of NGOs supporting people living with HIV across our region. But it is, I have to say, it's tough. I mean, if you're a refugee, for example, I was contacted by a refugee from Syria who was infected, and he was facing deportation back to Syria. So we managed to put him in touch with the UN agency that deals with refugees, and they were eventually able to get him asylum in Australia. But that's a long road to travel. And I wish I could say that there were better options, but there aren't at the moment, and that's what we've been fighting for. In particular, to get countries to realize that people who have HIV as I said, they can lead productive lives now. We have the technology. The problem is not really the medicine. The problems are all the laws and policies that reinforce the stigma and discrimination.
The problem is not about the medicine. It's about the laws and the policy.
And the attitudes, which are connected to those. Yeah,
absolutely. I do think there is, I'm going to keep saying this because I do think this needs to be ingrained in everyone who is listening, is that there is this stigma more so than there is these health risks, given the fact that we have this technology. Would you say that's an accurate statement?
Absolutely. Okay. What kills are the attitudes towards HIV.
And I want to just go back to the beginning of our conversation, which is describing sex in the Arab world. Can you tell us a little bit more about what sex looks like in the Arab world based on your research?
Well, it's a big Arab world. I mean, we're looking at more than 400 million people. We're looking at multiple religions and ethnicities, so it's hard to generalize. But one of the issues is that because we have these taboos around sex outside of marriage and talking about sex in public. Of course, people talk about sex all the time in private. Men are speaking to men and women are speaking to women, often in extremely frank terms. The problems start when you try to bring men and women together to have the conversations, and then when you try to take it public, because there's all sorts of censorship. I would say that what we don't have in the Arab region is really a very clear sense empirically about people's sexual practices and attitudes and behaviors. We don't have a Kinsey study. We don't have the sort of surveys that you see in Western countries because governments won't let us ask those questions. You cannot do a national survey on sexual behaviors in most of our countries. And even where you don't need to have government approval, so some of the work I've done, for example, on men and masculinities, where I've led these really big studies, nationwide studies on what does it mean to be a man, a lot of the aspects that we wanted to ask about in terms of sexual attitudes, we couldn't. Not just because in some countries governments won't let us, but also because very often the people whom we have asking the questions, the interviewers, they themselves feel very shy about talking about these matters. So they don't want to engage in these issues either. So we don't have a good sense in terms of statistics about what's happening. But clearly, anecdotally, everyone's doing everything. Basically, it's all tahta tarabeza. I mean, it's all going down, quite literally and figuratively. And we know that increasingly because although there is a reticence in the conventional media to talk about sexuality, we can talk a little bit about this because that's shifting a little bit. But if you go online and in social media, there's a complete flourishing. There are sexual conversations happening everywhere. Now, a lot of them are not terrifically well informed because, again, as I said, we don't have sexuality education in our schools for the most part. But there are places, there are new platforms to talk about sexuality in very frank, accurate, sort of scientific terms. Like there's a site called Al-Hub Thaqafa. It's called lovemattersarabic.com. It's extremely interesting. There you go and you see frank talk about all matters of sexuality, and people are writing in and asking questions. And we have lots of Facebook Live sessions with sexologists now across the region. So there is more conversation, definitely. The challenge we have and what we don't know is whether these very frank conversations are now translating into changes in practices and behaviors. But we do need to have that information if we're going to address all these sort of issues that we're facing in terms of sexual disease and dysfunction and other issues.
It's and I do appreciate you mentioning the fact that there still isn't stats about what the sexual behavior is of people in the region. But as we know, and just based on just common interactions with others and with our community, we know that it is something that is happening, and the lack of sex education and awareness is putting more and more people at risk to catching STDs or HIV. And I want to also just even now dive into the topic of something that you mentioned in a few of your research and talks, which is honor killings, and it's a very unfortunate subject. Can you tell us a little bit more about honor killings in the Middle East and North Africa region?
So it's a very shadowy topic, clearly, and it's not something I address directly in the book. I mean, I do talk about it because it does happen, and it is connected to issues of virginity, for example. I mean, it's very interesting how honor is formulated in terms of a very specific question about female relatives' comportment and their sexuality, basically. So the issue here is really, it's actually less about women and more about men. I mean, why do men feel that their honor is connected to their female members' sexuality? And that points to a deeper question we have in the Arab region, is about what's happening with men. Now, there's a lot of formulation and a lot of stereotypes, certainly in the West, about the Arab man. And these came to the fore when we saw the waves of migration, particularly from Syria into Europe. And there was all this framing of Arab masculinity as being very toxic and, really sexually rapacious, for example. I mean, it was really unfortunate. And it was one of the reasons that from 2015 till about 2020, I shifted gears a little bit in my work and moved on from, the great the great enigma of sexuality in the Arab world to the other great mystery is what on earth is happening with men in this region. Because it occurred to me that patriarchies are at the core of our societies, and yet we know very little about the pillars of these patriarchies, men. Now, it's very interesting that you describe my book as an exploration of female sexuality. So I talked to hundreds of people across the region in the course of doing the research, men and women. Now, the reason you hear mainly women's voices in the book is because they had rather more interesting things to say about sexuality.
Not surprised.
No, but aside from LGBTQ individuals, so gay men, for instance, who really do have to think about what masculinity means, most plain vanilla cis hetero men in the Arab world have never really been asked questions about what does it mean to be a man. So that's why I shifted gears and with a group called Equimundo and UN Women led a set of surveys in 7 countries across the region that interviewed more than 15,000 men and women about what it means to be a man. So I'm circling back here to your question about honor crimes, because it became very, very clear that it's not just these questions about controlling female sexuality, which lie at the heart of honor-related violence, but also that men really felt that they felt lost, basically. That the old models of manhood, where I am a man because I can provide for my family, for instance, have completely been blown apart because of the economics in the region. We have really high unemployment, particularly for young men. So they were at what I would say almost a crossroads. It was very clear that women were finding their place because there's been so much emphasis on women's economic and political and social empowerment, women's rights in the region. Mm-hmm. But in a sense, men have been left out of those conversations. So part of the reason for doing this research was to try to understand, well, how do men see the world in the Arab region? Where do they see their place in the world? And it was really revealing because this image that we have as a man on the top of the hierarchy, the pyramid of power, that's great for a minority of men. Mm-hmm. But the majority of men are down below, and the patriarchy is not great for them either. And that came out very clearly in this study.
I was going to ask, what was something that surprised you in the study that you didn't know before?
So it was interesting. We talked a lot about what men and women do at home, for example, who does what in terms of household chores, who makes the decisions. And we also followed them back into childhood. So when you were a boy or a girl, what did your mother do? What did your father do? What did you do as a boy? What did you do as a girl? And it was really, really interesting that the men, it's not surprising, but that the men who saw that their fathers did more of the housework, that their mothers and fathers shared decision-making, they would go on to do that in their own marriages. So history makes a difference. And it's very interesting that the men who had seen their mothers experiencing domestic violence, physical, emotional, economic, they would go on also to then repeat the cycle of violence. But we heard these really, really compelling stories from men. A Syrian refugee, I remember, who said that, look, when I was back in Syria before the war, I was a man of steel. I was in control. And now that I am in exile, I'm a refugee, I feel like I am made of tissue paper. I'm very easily torn and broken. So the men were having a really hard time adjusting to the fact, for example, as refugees in Lebanon, that the women could go out and work and the men had to stay at home because they were seen as a security risk to the state. So this inversion of roles, women seem to be adapting to it better, and that the men were really struggling. But we also heard these delightful stories of men in particular who loved being fathers, who were really engaged in raising their children. And then their daughters would go on to say how important it was, that the single most important thing in their lives to be able to have a profession, for example, to feel fulfilled, was that their fathers supported them. And there were lots and lots of stories of that as well.
So when it comes to the topic of masculinity, there's a lot of times you've mentioned that there is this cycle when it comes to men, that if they've seen their fathers are violent, if they've seen their mothers experience abuse, they're going to repeat that cycle. How can we break that cycle?
Again, not a unique issue to the Arab region. And what was interesting about the research that we did is that it very quickly translated into practice. So the group I was working with, Equimundo, does work on trying to engage men and boys on gender equality around the world. They have a wonderful program called Program P, which is actually about fatherhood. And so what we found is because the men loved being dads, and they loved, they weren't really getting their hands dirty with the nitty-gritty of baby care, but as the children grew up, they were very much engaged. And there seems to be a window in men's lives as they're about to become fathers where their brains open, basically. And if you can get into that window, then you can change a lot of the attitudes. So Program P works with couples around gender equality in the family because men like to be fathers and they want to be better at it. Right? So we gave them an incentive to come into this program, to pay attention. And this program, which was pioneered in a number of Arab countries, has showed us fantastic results, that we show a real decline in gender-based violence. So domestic violence declines as well. It's not rocket science. We know how to do this. It has been done elsewhere in the world. The question is bringing it to the Arab region and then translating it in ways that, are culturally resonant. We're going along the grain of culture, not against it. And there have been really quite some remarkable changes going on. But again, they're small scale, and we need to bring it up to the population as a whole.
Absolutely. We got to have the programming. We got to have education. And something you just said right now is that we have to go with the grain as opposed to against it.
We need to push the grain. I mean, I think a lot of people talk about, it's a sexual revolution. My sense is revolution doesn't work in our region. If you want evidence of that, let's go back to the Arab Spring, right?
Yeah,
we don't get change through dramatic rupture with the past. I think what we are seeing in our region is a sexual evolution in which certainly conversations are happening, some practices are changing. And I can give you an example of that. In my book, around the time of the Arab Spring, of course, there was so much talk about sexual and gender-based violence. The gang rapes in Tahrir Square, the sexual harassment on the streets of Cairo and elsewhere across the Arab region. We have seen remarkable shifts now over the past decade in terms of women feeling much more emboldened to speak out on sexual harassment and sexual violence, and really quite remarkable legal changes. It's not enough, but it's certainly heading in the right direction. So when we frame these issues in a way that resonates with the public, that as I said, that is not that is trying to find the opportunities in our religions and in our cultures for change, that's when we can see the progress. But again, it's not going to happen overnight. It's a very, very slow process. And that's not bad if we want the change to be steady and sustainable.
And that's very well said. And my question to you, as someone who studied this topic in this field for years, specifically in this region, where do you see the topic of sex going into the Middle East and North Africa? Where do you see sexual education going and moving forward in the Middle East and North Africa? Where do you see public policies and advocacy going in the Middle East and North Africa?
Again, very big and diverse place. I would say that certainly in terms of sexuality education, there are now conversations happening in a number of governments, particularly in North Africa. So I think Tunisia is an example, despite all its political problems, that there are conversations now happening about how can we introduce some form of sexuality education into the school system. My sense across the region is that we're still a long way from that. And I think if we're going to wait to have a system which looks like anything that you see, for example, in the West, that's not going to happen. That being said, there have been some incredible experiments in innovation. I quote one in my book. It's a group called Montada al-Jansaneya. It's in Palestine, in the West Bank, and it's been working with schools in very interesting ways to offer sexuality education in an extracurricular context, which has been very successful in at least getting information in ways that are applicable and acceptable to communities. So I think that the experimentation is what's interesting, that there are lots and lots of people trying to do different things in countries across the region. We are still a long way from, for example, really getting any movement on LGBTQ plus issues. It's still criminalized in most of our countries. There have been attempts, for example, in Lebanon to overturn Article 534, which criminalizes sex against nature. That didn't really go anywhere. My sense in the Arab region is that, for example, on LGBTQ+, the question here is not about trying to change the law on paper. It just takes too long and it's too controversial. So what we try to do is change the law in practice. So, for example, we work with police, all right? In some countries, for example, in Egypt's a good example. Egypt, LGBTQ plus individuals, particularly if they're from less socioeconomically advantaged communities, I mean, basically if they're not wealthy and not powerful, they tend to find themselves hoovered up. This is in the absence of a law. As I said, we don't have a law which criminalizes same-sex relations in Egypt, but they're caught up on other charges like prostitution or public morality. So one of the things you can do that's been successful in some countries is that you work with the police. I mean, do you really need to be arresting this person? And we've had success for the other populations. So in some countries, for example, if you're a woman, if you're a sex worker, for example, and you're found with condoms in your purse, you will be arrested because the condoms are used as proof that you are a sex worker. Now, of course, for those of us working on HIV, that's problematic. We want women to use condoms. If you're going to have unprotected sex, then for God's sake, use a condom. So you can work with police to say, look, do you really need to be doing this? Is this really a practice that's going to benefit your society? So there are ways of modifying the law in terms of how it's implemented, rather than opening the Pandora's box of trying to get legal reform.
Thank you for sharing the reality or talking about the LGBTQ plus community in this conversation. I wanted to just dive deeper into the reality of the queer community in the region. Can you tell us a little bit more about what issues they face on a day-to-day?
Wow, we could spend hours talking about this. And again, it's a very diverse group, and it isn't a community in the common sense that we would think about it, for example, in the West, because it can be quite fragmented. And I also need to point out that there is a fluidity to LGBTQ plus in our region. In my book, for example, I talk about meeting with men who have sex with other men who would never describe themselves as gay. It's not it's not their part of their identity. And yet, of course, there are very definitely individuals who, as part of their personal identity, see themselves as gay or lesbian or trans. It does rather depend on where you are in the region. And I don't mean to say that there's any sort of real acceptance of any sort of sexual diversity, because again, it's part of the Citadel, right? But I think in certain parts of certain countries, that there has been an ability to create support systems. So the classic example is Lebanon, and not all of Lebanon, but in parts of Beirut, for example, there are civil society groups, non-governmental organizations, NGOs, that offer support for people who are sexually diverse, so LGBTQ plus individuals. For example, recently they had a Pride. For Pride Month, they had events. Now, not a parade, clearly, because that's not how we roll in the region. But they are able to come together to talk about issues. And also the internet has been hugely valuable because there people can connect. And of course, I mean, people are hooking up all the time on Grindr or whatever other app they're using. I have to say that the key difference that I've found between sort of LGBTQ plus spaces in our region, whether it's criminalized or not in our countries, is that in the West, and I'm generalizing here also, there is the push to come out, to be visible, to be there in the public space. My sense in talking to many colleagues and friends who are LGBTQ+, it's not so much a desire to come out, because that's not what we do about sexuality in our region. It's still quiet. It's the desire to be able to stay in and do what you want to do and lead your life behind closed doors. that, and this is really important about how we think about moving ahead on sexuality in our region. There is a model in the West which has been about visibility. I would say in our region, we're looking at something very different here. We're looking at privacy and personal freedom. Again, I want to be free to do what I want to do in the privacy of my home, and no one else, not my family, not my community, not my government, interferes with what I want to do. And that, interestingly, that notion of privacy is, I think, our way forward in the Arab region to be able to secure some of these fundamental human rights as they relate to intimate life.
Very interesting point you mentioned, because like I do agree that in this part of the world, the Western side, coming out, pride, visibility is a main thing. I wasn't quite familiar with what it is in the region, but this idea of privacy does seem like it would apply from the LGBTQ perspective as well as for anybody that they just want that privacy aspect. I guess my question is there harm to live your life like that?
Harm, that's a very interesting term. And I would say, what's our measurement here? What do we really want at the end of the day? The notion of sexual rights, okay, is the ability to lead your sexual life free of violence or coercion. And I think finding that personal freedom is absolutely key. So there is this question of privacy, but the other element that we're missing in the region is personal freedom. And it's very interesting. I did an interview with a leading lesbian activist in the region, and we started talking about the notion of sexual rights and how they're very controversial in the Arab region. And she said to me, "Shereen, what are you talking about sexual rights in our region? We don't even have personal rights. In the records of the state, I am the daughter of my father. And if I were to marry, I would be the wife of my husband. How can I have sexual rights when I don't exist as an individual entity, either within the governmental context officially or within the eyes of my family?" So the key balancing here, it's not just privacy we're talking about, it's also personal freedom. It's that you can lead your life free of interference from the outside forces. And that's a problem. It's a challenge in our region because we don't really exist as individuals. I can tell you that if I'm in Egypt and if for whatever reason I get in trouble, at the end of the day, it's going to be my family I have to contact, and they have wasta, and they're going to be able to get me out of the mess. And coming back to one of the points I made earlier about the challenges, for example, of young people not being able to get married. I mean, one of the reasons they can't get married, they have to wait so long, is that they're economically dependent on their families. So we have this whole nexus that weaves people into a collective identity. And that's great. It has a lot of advantages, absolutely. But what it does pose challenges for is your ability to control your body. So we come back to the issue of the honor crime, for example, to have bodily autonomy. My body is my business. And it also has impacts on your ability to lead your intimate life in the way you want to. But it's very much a balancing act. And the challenge for us going forward in the Arab region is how do we strike that balance so that we benefit the individual and diminish the potential harms?
How does NGOs and civil societies look like in the Middle East and North Africa? And is there a difference between country to country? And how does it protect people's sexuality rights?
Again, it depends on the issues that we're looking at, and it depends on the country. In North Africa, in particular in Morocco and in Tunisia, although Tunisia is experiencing some challenges in this regard, there has been a much more developed civil society space. Similarly in Lebanon, because quite frankly, Lebanon hasn't had a functional government in a very long time. And without a strong government, most of the governments in our region are authoritarian, that vacuum allows for civil society and NGOs to provide services. So where they can operate with some relative freedom, then they can help support individuals who are facing challenges. So the clear example here has been for women and their experience of sexual harassment or gender-based violence, domestic violence. We've seen a real flourishing of those groups. I interviewed a fantastic group in Morocco that was working with unwed mothers. I mean, if sex outside of marriage is problematic, having a child outside of marriage is the absolute final frontier of haram. I mean, illegitimate children are, ibn haram. I mean, the son of the forbidden, right? But this wonderful group, which was started by a grandmother who is Aisha Shena, who sadly has passed away, really managed to create a space for unwed mothers that they could be accepted back in society, accepted by their families, keep their children, try to have some relationship with the father of their children. And that's a perfect example of what you can do if you also move along the grain of the society, you understand where the pushback is going to come from, and then you push forward only a little bit. But I've visited these young women who have had children outside of marriage, and it's really remarkable how these sort of NGOs can open up a space and open up a dialogue. We don't need to have everyone agree, but we do have to start talking about a lot of these issues in public. And so I think that where there is the right political conditions for these groups to exist, then they can do a world of good. But, that's a big ask, the political conditions, because very often governments in our region feel threatened by civil society groups, particularly if they relate to anything to do with political power. So again, it's a balancing act.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the history of sex in the region, in the Arab world?
What's interesting is that today we ourselves, as people from the region, but also the outside world, sees us very buttoned up about sex. But the reality is that if you go back 1,000 years, it was the Arabs who were much more open about sexuality, and the West that was much more closed. And over the centuries, our paths have crossed. It's really, really interesting. If you go back to our foundational texts in Islam, for example, if you look at Quran, if you look at Hadith, there are all these wonderful sayings and lessons and conversations about sexuality, because fundamentally in Islam, sex is not something that was frowned upon. Sex is celebrated. It is a gift from God. The interesting thing about the formulation of sex is that it's seen as such a powerful force that it needs to be controlled. And this is the reason for the primacy of marriage. If we don't control sexual urges, and by the way, in classical Islamic thought, it's actually women who are thought to have much more sex drive than men. Actually, Imam Ali, there's a famous saying of his that God created 10 parts of desire, and he gave 9 parts to women and 1 part to men, which also explains a lot about male anxiety about sexuality, because the wonderful history of all these fantastic books that we had, a whole history of erotica, which we would not see in the West, like conversations about every aspect of sexuality, from anal intercourse to zoophilia. We would not see this in the West until the sexual revolution of the 60s. So if you look back 1,000 years, we have these amazing books, and a lot of them are containing these chapters on how men, basically about aphrodisiacs and lotions and potions. And it's all about how men can step up in the bedroom in order to satisfy their partners. Now, what's really interesting about these books is that they also talk extensively about same-sex relations. Not just homosexuality, but female same-sex relations. And they're really quite remarkable because they show such a sophisticated understanding of female sexuality and about lesbian life that we lack today in the Arab world. And so one of the points I keep coming back to is that people who tell us, particularly conservatives, religious conservatives, or authoritarian governments, who want to stop conversations about sex, who take sex, wrap it in religion, and use it as a tool of social control because it's very powerful to keep people in check. My response to that is when people tell us that, we can't talk about this because, it's a Western import and we don't talk about these things. Go back to our history. Mm-hmm. To be authentically Arab and to be authentically Muslim is not to be afraid of sex. When conservatives tell you that it's black and white about these issues around sexuality or gender, there are actually 50 shades of gray on all these questions. We just need to have the knowledge of our past and the freedom in our future to be able to explore them and find a new way forward.
Wow. And kudos on the reference of 50 Shades of Grey. It's I want to just dive more into, because you mentioned a lot of great points right now. History of sex in the Middle East and North Africa, that we have a culture and literature that actually talks a lot about sex and different aspects of sex. How did we become so conservative?
Long story. Essentially, what's interesting is that this flourishing of writing on sexuality, which, by the way, a lot of it came from the ulama. I mean, these are religious scholars who saw nothing incompatible between the needs of the faith and the needs of the flesh. This writing, which really reaches its zenith during the Abbasid period, so we're looking for 8th to 11th or 12th centuries. As you look over time, it starts to wind down. And by the 19th century, it sort of dried up. Now, what's interesting is that the Abbasid period was the zenith of Arab political, economic, and cultural power. And it's very interesting that when we were at our heights and were influencing the world, we had no problems with talking about sex because it was seen as part and parcel of our cultural flourishing. A lot of the winding down, in particular, came when the region was colonized by European occupiers. And again, this is a very common history. It's not just for us in the Arab region. You see it across sub-Saharan Africa. You see it across Asia as well. When Europeans brought their so-called Victorian ideas around sexuality and their laws in particular, we start to see a closing down. And it's very interesting because this starts to also intersect with the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. And in particular, if one looks in Egypt and the rise of the Ikhwan Muslimin, one of the early arguments that they look at, and one of the early arguments they advance, is why have we lost all our power? Why are we now occupied by the Europeans? And the Europeans had this framing of Arab sexual culture, and this is again written about by Edward Said in Orientalism, is that we were completely dissolute. I mean, we're same-sex relations, anything went, basically. And the early writings about from the Muslim Brotherhood said, well, maybe these Westerners have a point. Maybe the reason that we are now being subjugated is because we are so sexually licentious. And that's where you start to get this closing down around sexual culture. And it really takes off after 1979 and the Iranian Revolution and the rise of Wahhabism and the influence that spreads. And so it's very important that the sex and the politics get entwined. But it is a rewriting of our history. And really, if we go back, when we had the freedom to question and to create, we didn't have the fear about sex. And it's not coincidental, they're connected. And part of the argument I make in my book is that even if in the political space it seems very closed in many of our countries, we can't really make much progress in terms of opening space to talk about fundamental rights. We can start to work on that in the bedroom, in our intimate space. And eventually, the intimate life connects to the public life. The personal is political. And so, keep questioning in your private life, and one day it will have an impact on your public life.
Wow. Personal is connected to the
personal is political.
The personal is political. Quote of the day, that's for sure. And before I wrap this up, we talked a lot about the history of sex. We talked a lot about how we've now become more of a conservative culture and what to do to challenge ourselves and the way we think about sex and sex education. Thank you once again, Shereen El Feki, for coming on Yalla Let's Talk. I'm sure a lot of our listeners are going to be tuning in and learning a lot from this conversation. I just want to take the time to remind our listeners to follow, first and foremost, Shereen El Feki. Where can we find Dr. Shereen?
So I'm on Twitter, assuming that it survives the next couple of months. I'm also on Threads. You can find me also on Instagram at Shereen El Feki, and I look forward to hearing from you. And thank you again for the opportunity to join you on Yalla Let's Talk.
Well, thank you once again. And guys, don't forget, We are streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Rami. You can find us on YouTube. #YallaBye.